Hi, welcome everyone to what I think is episode 21 of the lockdown, where I explore the lives of interesting people and friends who are still in lockdown or trying to get out of it, depends on where they are. And today I'm joined by a special guest, my friend Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, who is, among many other things, the CEO of 21st, a global consulting firm that works with companies around the world interested in capturing the competitive advantage of gender, nationality, and generational balance. She is a very, very widely known thought leader in this space as well, and her writings on Forbes, HBR, and other publications always put mine to shame, because even though we cover similar topics, she gets about 100 times the volume of readers and shares that I do. And it's perhaps because of that that I started collaborating with Avivah and have managed to raise the popularity of my own writings. And I'm very proud also to be affiliated with 21st as part of the advisory board. So Avivah, how are you today?
I'm very well. It's a gorgeous sunny day in Somerset, UK, where I am locked down from exactly a year now. Okay. Celebrated our 1-year anniversary just this week.
Okay, we'll believe you, even though what we can see is far from sunny, but I'm sure if you turn this around, we could. And the first question I tend to ask guests is, what their main observations are about humanity and themselves during this year or so that has passed. What have you learned about yourself and humanity in this unprecedented of circumstances?
Well, the word I have been using a lot all the way through is revelatory. I think it's a time of revelation. It's not exactly biblical, but it is. It's revelations, right? It shows to a lot of us individuals what we really care about, what we really miss, what we really don't. As what I thought was an extreme extrovert, have been surprised by how delightful it was to be locked down with my beloved and my dog for a year, not seeing anybody. That was surprisingly pleasant. And then watching the world. I mean, we've been doing a lot of this together, right? It's this kind of global report card where for the first time we can watch how governments and companies react to something unexpected, unprecedented, generation shifting. And it's all data driven and it's all comparative. And so it's a huge report card. And so yeah, as the kind of data junkies we are, it's fascinating. So being locked down in a barn, allowed to sift through data and then write about it, has been an unexpected gift. I've spent more time writing and thinking this year than I have in a long time. So,
What are you most looking forward to going back to? What do you miss? What's the first thing that you'll go back to that you couldn't do this year as soon as you're free to do so?
Yeah, friends, of course. There are a few friends. I am a big dinner party type. I love to sit down with just, 5, 6, 7, and a good bottle of wine, nice dinner, and just have a few hours together with other humans, not on Zoom. I've done a lot of Zoom.
You don't think the future of dinner parties will be Zoom or WebEx?
No, I think there was a really noted beginning of that, right? Early on in the pandemic, there were a lot of these kind of cocktails and dinners and a fair bit of that. And then I think for a lot of people that kind of tailed off, I do think there's a physical presence required for many people. I think particularly for young people. I mean, as I'm pushing 60, I think this has been, you're much luckier at this age to experience all this, because one, is a much smaller percentage of our entire lives that's just disappeared into this lockdown. And two, it's much, it's pleasant at this age, whereas it's really awful when you're younger and you might actually be still building a lot of connections, relations, ego, and status. And I think that's really hard. Whereas, yes, this kind of forced withdrawal from the norm and the world can be and has been for a lot of people a good time to do introspection if we did it. So.
What rating would you give to humanity on its ability to cope with this pandemic on a 1 to 10 point scale, where 6 is okay and average, and 10 is exceptional, 1 is awful?
See, that's the challenge, right? It's humanity overall. The average is brought down. I'd give it probably a 5, right? Because you see some companies, countries, couples that manage it really well, and then there are a whole bunch of really big, poor, toxically led countries that do it really, really badly and kill a whole bunch of their people that they didn't have to kill. And so the average is terrible, but the model of some of the better stuff that's come out is inspiring. And as usual, it's a smaller group than the kind of depressing end. We're still emerging, I hope that the arc of history and humanity goes towards progress, but I must say the last 4 years has shook up a lot of my generation's optimism on that front.
So when you persuaded me to write the joint HBR piece, which I will share on this idea that a small group of women who excelled at managing the pandemic and leading their countries through this crisis would fundamentally change leadership archetypes, I was actually reluctant, because the data science nerd in me is like, oh, small sample, even though I had written about it, as you know. But then I thought you were right. And I am very honest about this, the fact that we know that data tell, but stories sell. So even if the accuracy or academic or scientific impact of the argument is questionable, I'm very happy to ride the wagon, and take advantage of it. But the question now, since 7 or 8 months have passed, is, are you still confident that the image of these successful or effective heads of states will have a transformative effect on people's leadership criteria, archetype choices?
The other advantage of being old, right, is that you never have just a 1-year perspective, right? So I've been on this topic for a long time. It's like, so as I have been working in the space and watching it evolve over the last 25 years, to me, it's all just part of the same story, right? It's a slow, painfully slow, and very fast. I mean, my short form for this, when I remind people how quickly things are changing, is, our grandmothers got the vote, our mothers got the pill, my generation got a good job and a good education. I think the next generation is the leading edge. Countries are going to get shared parental leave. I think that's the next big kind of technological shift, social shift, that will level the playing field. And so in all that time, we have just been watching. I always say the 20th century saw the rise of women. The 21st century sees the adaptation or reaction of countries, companies, and couples to that rise, and some embrace it. So, you get the Nordic countries that are super gender balanced. You also, by the way, have communism that had gender equality as a fundamental pillar of its ideology. So in all our client companies, former communist countries are much more gender balanced than the West. So Eastern Europe is much more gender balanced than Western Europe. China, before it kind of derailed, was much more gender balanced than the US, for example. So do I think that this past year will have an impact? I think what we're seeing in the past few years, and every year a little bit more, is the emergence, the consequences of all this, right? The emergence of women into leadership roles gets everybody used to seeing how they're doing. And that this past year gave us this data report card thing we were talking about earlier, I think was an opportunity to highlight, look, as we get growing, small but growing samples, where we can start comparing men to women on all these kinds of measurable performance-related data, because that's the big fear, right? That's the underlying unspoken fear, that more women means less quality, less performance, less innovation, when the data increasingly, and every year the mountain of data is growing a bit. You're doing a good job at spreading it, but a lot of people still haven't heard that data, haven't seen it. So I think this pandemic and the media frenzy around this topic just helped to tell a story that's been emerging for a long time, right? And will continue to emerge. I just read another piece. It's not just this 7% of countries that are led by women. Now we've got a huge number of really big, impactful public sector organizations, right? The World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the US Federal Treasury. I mean, we've got women now in very visible roles of leadership, and we'll see how they do. But so far,
What are the common misconceptions or toxic beliefs that obstruct progress, especially in businesses and organizations? When you go and consult or want to advise on, let's say, gender balance, and I'm sure over and over again you have to demolish or try to help people reframe some very common misconceptions. So what are the sort of popular and irritating thoughts that if you could demolish them or eliminate them, you would, so that progress can happen faster?
There's quite a lot, right? But I wrote an article that was circulated also very well, which I was surprised by. And it was I call it the 5 M's that are the myths men still believe about gender balance, and a lot of women. I think
this is the Talent Quarterly, right? Which was one of the top article in Talent Quarterly. A very good article.
Yeah, and so I find it's easier to remember what all these obstacles. There are many obstacles, but our challenge is always to simplify them a little bit. So I called it the 5 M's, which was motherhood, masculinity, minimization, I can't even remember, and mentoring, right? And so I think the number one issue of motherhood is that most men explain imbalances in the workplace by the fact that women are mothers. Which is like, men are not fathers, right? It's just women who are mothers that are the problem. Like, not most children I know have 2 parents, not one mother. So that whole issue of how they rationalize their continuing imbalances is an easy way not to address them and the real reasons why they're imbalanced. So when you show, a leadership team what I call their gender jaws, which is the ratio of men and women as you go up the hierarchy, they'll say, yes, but that's because women choose to have children, as though it's a personal choice matter. So and that depends what country you're doing it in, and national cultures overlap with that. But that's probably the number one still reason today that most men explain this way. The second really big one is meritocracy. I won't go through all 5, but the second one, meritocracy. I mean, these guys really believe, and you know this better than anybody, they really, really believe, hand on heart, that it is a meritocracy, because of course they do, because they're usually at the top of it. So why wouldn't they want to believe that it's a meritocracy, right? How insulting if they think they got there for any other reason than their stellar performances and immense sacrifices throughout their lives, right? Part of which is true, but when you show them the data and these gender jaws, it's really hard to argue meritocracy. And so holding up a mirror to what the organization really looks like and how people feel in it is usually enough to start poking the holes at. So, but it takes somebody to go in and challenge them, right? So choose to challenge this year's International Women's Day was a good slogan, because it's way too long that we're still in the we got to help women, we got to get them to lean in and be more powerful, and then they'll be okay. That is not the problem in any organization.
It seems that still a lot of the often well-intended solutions or tips or interventions are really still trying to fix women as opposed to fixing the system or the endemic bias or flaws or unmeritocratic kind of dynamics that women are forced to operate in, right?
Yeah, and if you dig a little bit as to why that might be, it becomes pretty quickly pretty obvious, right? You go into these organizations, and especially because they're hugely influenced by the American approach to all this, so they always have these employee resource groups and affinity groups. So they put all these women together off in a corner to let them find the problem, identify the problem, and propose solutions, as though they know, right, how the organizations work and how decisions are made and how people are actually promoted. And these women's groups very often attract women at the peak of their kind of crisis, which is the 30s, right? So it attracts somewhat younger women who then get really excited about, yeah, let's have women's networks and let's do things. And because they don't have the systemic overview of what they're in, propose not very radical solutions that aren't necessarily the most relevant. And then the guys are more than happy to say, yeah, well, that's what the women asked for, so that's what we're going to do, right? Mm-hmm. It's immensely frustrating.
Yeah. What is your view on quotas, gender quotas?
I think one of the key things when you're working inside organizations is vocabulary. So just use the vocabulary that makes sense to the sector or side you're in. So quotas make sense in politics because politics is supposed to be a representation of your electorate. So yes, get quotas into politics, get parties to be 50-50, impose it, require it, legislate it, everything. In business, you don't need quotas, just put targets. You have targets on every other business imperative, change management goal, blah, blah, blah. So just use the words account. And most companies do have targets. Just why would you call them quotas? And this idea of governments regulating, I think the challenge if governments are regulating quotas in the private sector is that only works if you're in a country where the government is gender balanced. Whereas very often that's not where it's coming from, right? It's coming from governments that are very imbalanced, preaching to the private sector. And I think that's much more difficult to sell and accept.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think with generational changes, and we'll get into generational differences and parity soon, but do you think, this intuitive idea that younger people are naturally less sexist or less prejudiced, at least by the standards of traditional kind of, stereotypes or prejudice categories, that in itself, through sheer inertia, will drive some positive changes? In other words, when the 20-year-old people of today are 30 and become managers and leaders, they will bring kind of a different mindset to this? Or what is your thought on this?
I wish. You got to remember 100 years ago when our grandmothers got the vote, it was because men voted to give women the vote, right? So it's not like men have always been Neanderthals and every generation of men gets better. It's that in every generation, there are progressive men who want this to change and I think that's one of the huge mistakes that a lot of us women make and still make, is to keep thinking that this is a women's issue and keep thinking that women need to lead the change. And I think there have always been men. Every CEO I've worked with in the last 15 years on gender balancing the company have been men and absolutely determined to balance their organizations. So this is not men versus women. In almost every country where I am, it's progressives versus conservative forces that prefer the status quo. And do those two, I almost think, and you probably know more about this, it's probably personality type more than it is I'm sure we're going to find a biological metric, like that whole thing about smell and disgust, and people who feel more disgust or have a higher sense of disgust vote more conservative. I think it's going to be stuff like that we suddenly discover. And I think that's got nothing to do with generations. I think there will be conservative parts of the next generation. All the young guys who voted for Trump, there were quite a bunch of them. Young women who voted for Trump, for that matter, most white women. So explaining these things away too simply, I think is very hard. And I also think it's an analysis of what's currently the obstacles isn't just sexism, right? It's systems and cultures and legacy, and what do we think of as a leader, because it's both men and women who've been shaped by history, right? And unshaping us will still take some generations. So and it's fragile, right? It's very vulnerable to the kind of populist leaders we're seeing emerge with their toxic macho masculinity. If that continues to rise, are young people going to save us? I don't know. The pendulum keeps swinging, right? So I think, no, we have to do a better, and I think we have to do a much, much better job globally of engaging men in a conversation of how and why gender balance is win-win.
Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about generations and generational differences and the balance. I'd love to hear a bit more about the book you're working on right now.
Well, this has been a delight, right? So I was very impacted by Linda Grattan's book, The 100-Year Life, which I read a few years ago. And I'm just fascinated by a lot of the data that, again, isn't all that well known, right? That lifespans are expanding dramatically, that we basically are getting an extra 30 years of life compared to those grandmothers who got the vote. I wish they'd had a little bit more time. And so what are we going to do with these expanding lives? And it has a lot of overlap, of course, with my gender interests. But I was particularly interested on what do we do with those last 30 years? And do we have any role models of how to manage much longer lives and much longer careers? So the book is called Late Work, From Recreation to Recreation. And it's exploring the challenge, because a lot of us, our parents retired. So our internal models of what we do after 65, in addition to all this national policy around the world that is mostly, you stop, you retire, which is completely obsolete already given our state pension requirements and things like that. But I think if we don't have models around us of what we can do and how we can reinvent and how you can and should go back to school, very fascinating to me that very few universities have dedicated programs for the sort of 60-year-old cohort on how to reinvent and prepare and learn for another 10, 20, 25 years of productive life. Who knows what we're heading towards.
So obviously the macroeconomic case is hugely important. Aging population needs to stay active and contribute to the economy more than ever before, as debt increases and subsidies, etc., go up even more so. I'm very interested in kind of the other side of the equation, which is assuming you don't have to work and assuming, you made enough money and you're self-sufficient, or, you have enough. What are the kind of leisure opportunities that are there, and do we need to pay more attention to that? I mean, obviously it's not something that just affects older people. I think, what anyone would do with more free time today is, look at what our neighbor's cat had for breakfast and put in the cat filters on Zoom. And, there's not that much productive enjoyment or leisure time there. But what about, let's say, for 65 plus or whatever cutoff points you're using as a kind of late boomers or stage or older generation in life? What about leisure time?
Well, I think the issue is actually this latter part of life isn't about leisure time, right? This is the probably the bigger word is meaning making, right? How do you find meaning in much longer life? How do you have a purposeful, particularly for people who have been, I mean, I think the challenge is even bigger for people who have been successful, have been in impactful roles with lots of status, money, and recognition. You can't suddenly go on a cruise and play golf and become unknown and uninfluential, right? So what do you do? And I've been trying to come up with different models that I've been identifying. And so, some people are on a continuum. They just keep going. Doing university professors are a really good example. They just keep going till they drop. They teach, they write, they speak. That's not that. And plus with online, that's going to be much easier. There are those who become entrepreneurs. The biggest growth in entrepreneurship is in the 50 and 60-year-old crowds, who I just heard from some Goldman guy are actually outperforming. Their companies are more successful on average. There are the duets, which I'm studying with delight, which are couples that actually in retirement get together to start a company, an activity, a philanthropic thing, an angel investing, something they do together and then travel around and make this a joint venture. And then there are the kind of recreation types who really reinvent, do something completely different, often linked to an early life passion that they didn't have time for, weren't allowed by their community or families, or it wasn't a money making enough, and they get to do it later. And then there's the whole issue of portfolio careers, which is actually the most popular vote I always get is people want a portfolio career, which means they want to do everything, right? They want to have some time for family, they want to have time for friends, they want to have time for usually some kind of giving back and generativity. And they usually are grandparents and want to have a lot of time for that too. And then it becomes a balance of things, which is so opposite to what they had to do for the 30 or 40 years that they were full-time workhorses somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I mean, within organizations and especially businesses, do you find some industries in which being older is associated with being wiser, having more expertise, and people kind of respect you and look up to you, and then others, is it a bit industry dependent or company culture? What's your experience on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of all of that, right? It's tech is obviously the challenge, right? Tech is so young, youth oriented. You're old by the time you're 30, and people are worried about that. For women, any sector or career that's depends on how they look. Mm-hmm. Actresses, are really under pressure, and you hear young people saying, they need to start, getting cosmetic surgery at impossibly young ages. But on the whole, and then I think where you have this elder knowledge respect thing is going to be in the knowledge industries. So in the academy, of course, I think there's a lot of space for the older, especially if they're well known and they've done well and are published and are references in their field. They never age. I mean, they never go off. And I think that's true also in professional services firms, law firms. There are a lot of, so what's really funny is I was working with a law firm not too long ago, and the partners had put in a rule that you had to retire at 60. And they had put that in 10 years ago when they were all 50 and wanted to get rid of the people above them so they could finally get a bigger share of the pie. And now they're 60, they're all approaching that average, and suddenly it's them, right? And they don't want to. And the whole issue of older workers is fascinating, right? It's not very flexible, just like parents. It's not very flexible. You're either full-time or you don't exist. And yet We have really knowledgeable experts that you don't really want to lose, particularly since the demographics are kind of going in a different direction. You don't have that many really great, skilled, experienced young people in a lot of organizations. But the ability for these older people to, work part-time, work flexibly, have different kinds of career maps is still just emerging, right? And the big issue is money, as always. It's so, will people ever be willing to earn less at a later part of their career when, as you say, they've earned enough, right? they've had the time, the peak, the thing. But if money is an estimation of value, it's very hard for people to accept that they might get, and yet they'd be very happy, a lot of them, to stay flexibly and help the younger generations along. So how are we going to be a little bit more innovative in that space is something to keep an eye on. And very, very few organizations I've found are doing anything in that space at all. So if anybody listening is, please contact me, because I'm trying to get the innovators and leading edge companies to share some of their ideas.
And is this, your research and now writing, is it making you rethink your own career, especially at the stage you're in now, given that you're kind of part of the group you're writing about, or are you pouring in some of your own experiences and, kind of views on yourself onto the book now because you are transitioning onto this phase?
Yeah, both, like always, right? I already wrote a first book that I wrote was Late Love, Mating in Maturity, which was about leaving, marriages in later life, which is where the peak of divorces are, is in the 50s and 60s right now in the West. And when I did that, I decided, okay, I got to go study myself, but I got to understand what we are part of the cohorts we're in. And so understanding the wider context is always interesting. And so Late Love, Mating, and Maturity was studying kind of the 4 phases of decision making. And it was leaving, looking, loving again, and leaping into a whole new life. And what's interesting is I think the structure of this late workbook is almost exactly parallel. People have this really hard time leaving, and I do too, leaving. You're at the top of your game, you got the status, you got the reputation, you got but you're tired of it, right? You've been doing it for decades, right? You're the expert, and you don't want to talk about this stuff anymore. You've been around it intellectually so often. You can't bear, yet another person saying that, well, yeah, but women have children, right? And that you have to explain again. So the leaving phase of letting go of status, identity, ego, the first half of life, and then looking around, right? How do you, at this age and stage, in a very ageist society where companies certainly aren't hiring, right? How do you look for opportunities, roles, new things that you might want to do is a really interesting exercise. And then falling in love with what it is that you're going to invest in and leaping into creating something that's absolutely the phases I'm going through, and a bunch of people. So I've been through COVID on regular weekly calls with what I call my 6 old broads. And it's women from the age of, I think we're 59 to 73. And it's just been fascinating to have very wide-ranging conversations like this one on what are they all thinking about and what are they trying to do. And a lot of them are, in one way or another, working in this longevity space in a bunch of different countries. So seeing some of the issues in different places is fascinating. But ageism is kind of the biggest issue, discrimination and bias that nobody is yet talking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is there a sense when people get to that age, having accomplished a lot and having been successful, and as you say, in many ways being at the peak of their wisdom and experience and knowledge and resources, that you get a little bit of legacy anxiety and think, okay, I've done this, but what's the point of all of this, and what's my purpose, and what do I want to be remembered for? And then you try to kind of recalibrate a little bit and focus on your legacy more. And are you finding that yourself personally?
So I think this is where my longevity work overlaps with the gender piece. I think there's a huge difference between men and women that I'm studying, particularly boomer. So what you just described, the legacy piece, most of what are in our minds as maps of success are very male normed, right? It's this kind of upward linear path, and by your 50s you're CEO and you're on board and you're blah blah blah, blah. And that's kind of then it is, I think, for those men, like, what do I do when I'm no longer that person? And I think that's a big transition. It's a very interesting one. I think it takes a lot of work, and how prepared they are is how much other things they've ever been involved with, or were they very uni-focused, and was what they were uni-focused on meaningful or not? Did they believe in it, or was it just a means to other ends? For women, I'm seeing a completely different map of, like, you might have seen David Brooks of New York Times wrote a typical male book on later life called The Second Mountain. I love that, right? It's like, that's what men do, right? They climb a mountain. Everything's about verticality and getting to the top. And then they finish one, and then what do they want to do? They want to go get another one, right? I think that's
so he wasn't talking about his ego, but achievements, basically.
But I think that's a lot how organizations think, right? In mountains and peaks and heroes' journeys, right? And it doesn't map very well for most women that I know, which have very different lives. They're much more mountainous or hilly all the way along. Typically, a lot of women won't achieve huge things early because they're trying to balance a lot of things. That may change, especially for people who don't have children anymore, where our birth rates are plummeting. But what I'm seeing emerging is that women's best career years may actually start at 50. And then you've got the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. And if you look around the world at some of the big emerging female leaders who are now running the World Bank, the IMF, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the US Federal Treasury, they are in their 60s and even 70s. And that's
how old is Angela Merkel, by the way?
I think she's 66, if I remember right. So she started a bit earlier, right?
What do you think she will do, when she steps down? Obviously not become a reality TV star.
she'll do something. Pretty sure she'll do something. I mean, I think she'll be a global mover and shaker, whether we see her or not. I think too many people will need her calm, resolute, very effective leadership on so many hot button topics. And will she do it? Yeah, I think she'll do it.
So, but you were talking about, more continuing with alpha-like status, accomplishments, after retirement, that second mountain and stuff being male normative. But in general, isn't there a sense in the Western world, and I want to talk a little bit about nationalities before, we go, or you go, that the Western world being not spiritual enough and very kind of, achievement focused and centric and materialistic, etc. What about that kind of East versus West divide, or spirituality in general? Isn't it not to be found in externally valued accomplishments to begin with?
Absolutely. And I think that is what, there are a lot of people asking, why do we live longer? Why do humans now live so long? I think it's a nice question, right? And I think it's because very often the last third of life is about going inside, coming to terms with much more spiritual or much more sort of world-saving kind of scope. That's very much Harvard has this one-year program called I think it's called the Leadership advanced leadership initiative run by Rosabeth Moss Kanter that's very much using leadership skills to save and address some of the world's biggest issues, which I think is where a lot of people like Angela Merkel will be investing, right? And that's, I think, why humans live longer, is because some of us, and for the moment, sadly, a minority, will age wisely, will mature into conscious, thoughtful elderhood. You know this group called the Elders, which are all these famous, like Nelson, I think that was started by Nelson Mandela, right? So it's a group of global leaders who've gotten together to help with pressing world problems. And they're called the Elders. I think that's a very good model of where we will increasingly go as people become more prepared, more thoughtful about how will they spend the last 30 years and what can they do and how can they help. I don't think they're going to be playing golf and going around on cruise liners. Some will, but I think especially for people who've been very engaged and experienced through life on a broader range of ideas, I think they're going to want to keep engaging. And it's all the research shows how important social relationships are to happiness and healthy aging. And so you want to stay connected, right? You want to stay in the world of the world.
So, you just pointed out, I think rightly so, that generational prejudices and inequalities or imbalances are rarely discussed and not given the attention that they should, and especially negative attitudes towards older people. You also work a lot in the space or realm of nationalities and advocate for internationality or international kind of equality, etc. And obviously you have a very international, global, cosmopolitan background yourself. Do you see a tension? First of all, why aren't companies or organizations talking about this more explicitly? It's rarely the case that we talk about diversity or culture fit, and then we acknowledge that it's often where people come from to begin with that might be a problem or an advantage for organizations. Do you think it's generally not discussed enough, missed or overlooked?
My experience of the nationality balance in big companies was the number one priority. It just isn't talked about because it's not seen as a diversity dimension. It's like core strategy. Our biggest emerging market in this sector is India or China. So we need some Indian and Chinese in our leadership pipeline. It's kind of like a no-brainer that everybody understands. But it only affects like the global exco. You're talking 200 people at the top of an organization of 100,000 people. So the nationality balance is a quiet kind of push. It doesn't need, it's not in every country, it's not at every level. It really is for the emerging group of leaders that are going to run the future. And some companies are very intentional about balancing out their group of nationalities. I remember working for an offshore oil services firm that had a map of people, the CEO ready in 3 years, ready in 5 years, and ready in 10 years. And instead of having people's names, they had people's nationality flags because they wanted to make sure that their leadership team would always represent world that they serve. That's really unusual. But I think that's kind of the strategic underpinning. And any company that wants to go global, it's really hard if you're run by 12 men of the same nationality, which most companies are. A lot of companies are still completely dominated by one culture. And that has so many risks when you start working across cultures.
And for those that generally want to become more mixed or diverse from a nationality standpoint, surely they have to balance that with, in many places, a rise of nationalism and populism and sort of politics that are seem to be going in the other direction as well, right? So
absolutely. So yeah, I don't know how fast we're going to see Chinese run companies start, nationality balancing their excos. That's probably unlikely, right? And the swing on whether global companies would become more or less international has been a long ongoing story for 30 years, right? Globalization and its discontents keep swinging. But I think it's really hard to run a global company today without a whole host of nationalities that understand all the key markets that they're trying to grow. And you can see it, right? You can see it right now shifting eastward very much. And so, yeah, I don't think this issue is going to go away, but it's not, it's never on the ground, right? Because in any given country, it's going to be more locals that you're trying to pick a few good locals that will go up to regional roles or global roles. But then it's the mix. How do you get the mix to be the right balance for your business going forward? It's an interesting exercise.
I think one of the most surprising statistics, and I can't remember the exact figure, but it's something along the line that the percentage of people who work, so the percentage of the global workforce who work in a country other than the one they were born, is something like 6% or 7%. And that's sort of, consistent. UN, World Bank, all of the statistics are the same. And it's, if you're based in places like London, New York, and even more so Dubai, Singapore, this seems crazy, like an inaccuracy. But the reality is that on a per capita basis or percentage basis, we're probably less globalized today than ancient Rome or ancient Greece were, in terms of kind of migrants moving around and going. Obviously, nobody knows, but what happens when people can work from anywhere? The cost of living in cities was already crazy, and governments are making it harder for people to migrate for visa purposes or the virus. How do you see like the short-term future, the next 5 years? What shifts or changes do you think might happen in even big organizations of the world of work?
I mean, on the cross-cultural front, I think what's interesting is, again, this pandemic. Many of us, me included, and you probably too, have probably had more global conversations and more interactions with people. Every conference that used to be a little conference of a few people getting together, in a nice city, is now automatically global. Every small event I've run has gone global. And so now, more than ever, you have had this extraordinary increase, and thousands of people signing in to listen to the same. We've never had this before, right? So this too is new. And while the forces of anti-globalization are strong and anti-cosmopolitanism are strong, the appetite for people to connect across borders is huge and remains huge. And I think the young will always want to know what's going on elsewhere and compare. And and the stories and data and social media that give us more and more information about more and more places, unless they lock it down, which some of our charming populists may yet, carve themselves off like the Chinese. I think that appetite for cross-cultural experience seems only to increase with every generation. So I think generations there have, and governments can quash it. Look at what they did to the poor young in the UK with this Brexit thing. I mean, the young voted to stay. And it'll be really interesting to see when that generation grows up a bit more, the Brexiteers die off, what will happen will be fascinating. But I think I don't see any lessening of appetite for people to know what it's greener everywhere else, right? The travel numbers, the statistics, okay, we may never travel again and climate change may stop that, but the appetite remains. And I think has strengthened over this past year.
Yeah, and I think when people change their behavior because they're forced to, they want to go back to what they were doing. It wasn't a choice, right? We could have chosen all of these things before, to travel less, to work from anywhere, and not, but we didn't. So I think there's a sense that people are looking to return to some of the past habits, and hopefully others will be abandoned.
And and back to the longevity issue momentarily, so many people imagine that their later years will be a time to discover and travel and go elsewhere. And maybe that is the time. There is no better way to learn about yourself than to go and travel to places far and very, very different. So
yeah, Avivah, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure, as always. I hope you stay well and that we see each other in person prior to 2057.
Hey, you're moving international. So
Yes,
that should
exactly.
be
Yes, that's always the case. It can always be. There's always a chance there if one can move from A to B. Hey, thank you and have a great afternoon. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.